Hello lovely people, it's Meaghan. I'm going to be chatting through a few books today that I've really enjoyed recently, and we're going to be looking at these reviews through an anti-oppressive SMF lens. So SMF, or Sexuality, Marriage and Family Studies, is an undergraduate program at St. Jerome's University at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. And it's a fantastic program because there is so much of an emphasis on anti-oppression and intersectionality, and personally I've learned so much, but because I've been in SMF, I have a certain lens that I bring to consuming really any kind of media, but for me very much it applies to when I'm reading books. So these reviews are going to be from an anti-oppressive SMF lens. Alright, so the first book I want to talk about is The Hate You Give by Angie. The main plot of this book is that 16-year-old Star Carter lives in two very different worlds. So she lives in this poor, predominantly black neighborhood where her family grew up, and she goes to school in a rich white neighborhood at an elite prep school. Star keeps her two worlds pretty separate, and she works really hard to make sure that they never meet. She has best friends in both of these worlds. Her dad has never met her white boyfriend, who he would disapprove of, and she really has to kind of separate these two worlds that she lives in. The separation of Star's two worlds comes crumbling down when Star witnesses the death of one of her childhood best friends, Khalil, at the hands of a police officer. Star struggles to put back together the pieces of these two lives in the face of racial inequity, senseless violence against the black community, and the trauma of losing people that she loves too soon. So I really enjoyed The Hate You Give, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes that made it such a great book. So The Hate You Give really highlights the lived experience of what it means to have an intersectional identity. Star isn't just part of the black community in Garden Heights, having grown up with her large extended family and her neighbors, but she's also a part of Williamson Prep School, and she has that connection with her academic life and her friends there. While she's a part of both worlds, Star often expresses this divide within herself, which results in an ability to feel totally at home in either place. Star engages in code switching, where she has to speak differently depending on her surroundings and her audience. So for example, with her friends at her school, Star tones down her use of AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, and kind of those slang words, which she expresses that she hates doing, but she says that she doesn't want to be seen as the ghetto black girl, or be judged in any way for her use of that kind of language, even though people around her, her white peers, are using that language pretty commonly. With her friends in Garden Heights, she has to tone down her connection to anything bougie or high class, such as the school that she goes to or the people that she has relationships with at this school. As a result, there's a further separation of Star's worlds as she struggles to reconcile two seemingly opposing cultures. The Hate You Give also reflects on current racial politics and the racial bias of the police system and the legal system, and how those systems are often incredibly violent, especially when interacting with racialized people. When her friend Khalil is shot by a white police officer, he is unarmed at the time. And when information of his possible association with gang activity and drugs in Garden Heights surfaces, the media in the story focuses on victim blaming and shifts to focus only on the kind of ghetto aspects of Khalil's life and not the person that he is, and more importantly, not the fact that this was a completely senseless act of police brutality and police violence. Star becomes a strong voice for her community and for racial equality, fighting for justice for Khalil and for other victims of racial bias and hate crimes. Star's mother and father respond to police brutality differently, and Star finds her voice with the help of a political advocate and mentor, and she's able to find an outlet for the overwhelming injustice that she's experienced in her community. Star's ability to find a voice to address this injustice helps her to reconcile her two very different worlds and begin to see herself reflected in the world at Williamson Prep, her school, in a way that she hasn't been before. As you can tell by all of the stickers on the cover, The Hate U Give has seen incredible commercial and critical success. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 50 weeks and earned a number of different esteemed awards and starred reviews. But the book has attracted critics calling for its censorship because of vulgar language and the use of profanity, and even what's described as racially insensitive language, despite the fact that it is an Own Voices book written by a Black author depicting lived experience of Black folks. While many books geared towards a teen audience have been banned over the years, stretching back as far as Judy Blume, vulgarity is not used inappropriately in The Hate U Give, but as a way to understand Star's world and the importance of the use of language and what it represents. Critics have used this language snobbery, critiquing the use of AAVE and profanity, disguising their judgment as concern for the morality of teen readers. Many teen books use vulgar and profane language in their pages, but it always seems like books on the banned list are books that have tackled problematic political topics such as LGBTQ stories, stories where sexuality is related to pleasure, or stories related to racial inequities like The Hate U Give. It's almost as if profanity and sexual content are being used as an excuse to censor much needed political commentary. And when a book is dealing with the very real violence against Black communities by law enforcement, and it's described as vulgar, isn't this a form of tone policing that says, we want to hear your story, but the truth of the violence you're portraying is too violent? The next book on my list is These Witches Don't Burn by Isabel Sterling. The main plot of the book is that Hannah is a witch living in Salem, but she is a real witch and part of a coven who hide their true nature from regs, or regulars, basically non-magical people in the world of the book. Trying to get over her ex, Veronica, is tough for Hannah when Veronica is part of her coven and seemingly won't let Hannah go after their summer trip together. During this trip, the two encountered blood witches, of which they knew very little, except that they were powerful, and that one was now determined to seek revenge on Hannah. When violent events start happening to Hannah's circle of friends, she knows that there must be a blood witch in town, but she's unable to openly use her powers in case she's exposed. So Hannah must root out this witch before her coven finds out what happened that summer with Veronica. So again, diving into some themes that made These Witches Don't Burn a really good read. Many books with queer characters often include a coming out story, which is very important to see reflected in the literature, but These Witches Don't Burn treats diverse sexualities and gender expressions as kind of taken for granted, which is really refreshing. As a queer reader myself, it is so good to see representations of queer relationships the same way that straight relationships are represented. When the character Cal in this book tells Hannah that he's transgender, acceptance is commonplace, and his identity isn't treated as the most important thing about him. Hannah and Cal instead immediately begin to bond about experiences with their exes. So another character in the book, Meaghan, tells Hannah that she's bisexual and that her father is also bisexual, and lets her know that she's experienced stigma from the queer community before because of her identity. Meaghan doesn't express any evidence of internalized homophobia because of her experiences with others, but instead informs Hannah that she's bisexual and that if Hannah, who's a lesbian, wants to have a relationship with her, she has to accept her sexuality. These depictions of queer characters are great because they normalize diverse sexual and gender identities, allowing queer characters to exist with complex personalities and interests beyond and including their sexual or gender identity. Hannah is a lesbian, but she's also a witch, and also dealing with the fallout of an intense first love and relationship ending in betrayal. The author, Isabel Sterling, in interviews has also spoken about how her own queer identity blossomed and unfolded while writing this novel. She met and married her wife during edits of the novel, and she said that her characters became more queer as she revised and edited. Even the love interest character, Meaghan, was based partially on her wife, who Isabel never initially intended on including in These Witches Don't Burn. Another really interesting theme in this book is the handling of Hannah's breakup with Veronica and their problematic, possibly even codependent relationship. Hannah finds it really difficult to get over Veronica emotionally, even though she's made the mental choice to do so. Veronica, out of selfishness, holds on to Hannah and can be actually really emotionally manipulative throughout the book, not allowing their attachment to die off. This might suggest that there could be some attachment issues that Veronica has, as she feels that Hannah is abandoning her, and she clings more tightly to Hannah, even though Hannah has repeatedly expressed her boundaries about being with Veronica and about that relationship being over. The social context of their coven also impacts Hannah's ability to have a clean breakup with Veronica, as Hannah and Veronica have to work together regularly and they share lots of common social connections. Hannah has to reconcile this social reality if she wants to leave her relationship with Veronica behind. And I think the author has done a really fantastic job of writing about the complexities of breakups and the many ways that it can be so difficult and painful to dissolve romantic attachments. So the last book that I want to talk about is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This was an absolutely fantastic book for so many reasons, but kind of what it's about is it's a story told from the viewpoints of 6 characters. Okay, technically 5 characters, but the 6th guy has chapters in the 2nd book and he's just as important in my opinion, so I'm going to say that it's from the perspective of 6 characters. And we see the story of their little crew unfold as they journey from the dingy alleys of the city of Ketterdam on a mission to break into and back out of an impenetrable fortress. So it's a heist. People have described it as like Ocean's 11 but with magic, which I think is really accurate. And the cast of characters is really what makes this book so gripping. Described by the publisher, the cast of characters includes a convict with a thirst for revenge, a sharpshooter who can't walk away from a wager, a runaway with a privileged past, a spy known as the Wraith, a heartrender using her magic to survive the slums, and a thief with a gift for unlikely escapes. So let's get into the themes. First of all, I think that the female characters in this book are so well represented. They really aren't your typical fantasy women. I mean, I've read a ton of fantasy books where the women are depicted as these ethereal, born sexy yesterday trope, and it's really obvious that the women are written for the male gaze. But that's not the case here. I mean, the book is written by a woman and it depicts women really, really well. So Nina, one of the 2 female characters in the cast, is described as sexy, and that's a large part of her narrative, is her relationship with one of the other characters in the book, but it is not the most important thing about her, and she acts as a hero in ways that are completely independent of her love interest throughout the book. Another thing that I really appreciate about Meaghan is that she's not skinny. She's curvy, she's described as being heavier, and I think that that is so important because fantasy especially, like I mentioned, has this kind of trope of the typical female character, and she really breaks that mold. Inej is the other woman in the group, and she's a woman of color, and she isn't praised for her body but for her skill and her wit. And built into the narrative of the story is a critique of eroticizing and exoticizing women of color, which I thought was really interesting and really well done. Something that did kind of strike me as I was breaking down the female characters for this video was that Inej is Suli, which is a fictional ethnic identity in the universe of these books, and it's inspired by South Asian ethnicity. And I did kind of wonder why it was that the white woman is seen as the sexy character, and at the same time Inej, who's the racialized woman, is only seen as really valuable for her, you know, intellect and her skills. But at the same time, part of Inej's narrative is that she has these experiences with sex trafficking, and she defies this idea of being eroticized for her ethnicity and reduced to a sexual fetish. And we do also see later in this book and into the second book in this duology that Inej does have kind of a romantic relationship begin to evolve, but it's not based on fetishizing her for her ethnicities. Overall, these women in this book are badass, and they're very dimensional, which is something that I don't see a lot of in YA fantasy or in fantasy in general. So often I see women in fantasy, even female protagonists, written in a way that's fairly flat. So not to hate on The Hunger Games by any means, I love that book, but to compare to someone like Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games, these characters don't need to be callous to be heroes. They have personalities, they have sexualities, but they're not reduced to their sexualities, which I think is really cool. Another thing that I love about Six of Crows is that the cast is incredibly diverse in terms of physical and mental ability, race, sexuality, body size, socioeconomic status, gender, etc. There's such a breadth of representation in this book. Among the 6 main characters, not to mention the Grisha kind of magical identity in the universe as an allegory for minority discrimination. What I especially appreciate about the diverse representation is that disability and sexuality and different kind of aspects of identity are never central to the plot, but are presented instead as aspects of the characters, kind of similar to what I was talking about with These Witches Don't Burn. Disability is never something presented as an obstacle to overcome, but rather simply a facet of these characters' identities, and not something that makes them in any way less than. Another thing that I loved about this book was the trauma representation. Again, trauma is dealt with in a really eloquent way in this book. There's one character in particular who has pretty significant trauma responses throughout the book, and it is relevant to the plot, but it isn't depicted ever as something that makes the character any less capable. I also think that it's really cool that the trauma depicted isn't violent for this character. I think it's difficult and kind of rare to come across representations of PTSD that don't stem from the character experiencing combat, so I thought that was pretty great to see. Overall, this book does so much while also just being a truly fantastic YA fantasy novel with everything that you would want from that kind of story, so definitely something that I would recommend to anybody. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. check out the SMF program at St. Jerome's University if you're interested. There will be links down below. I'll also put links in the description to all 3 of the books that I talked about today if you're interested in checking any of those out. And if you like the video, like it, check out the other videos on the channel. So thanks for watching, and make sure to keep reading.